The Ruskin Cave Recreational Park in Tennessee may seem like a picturesque escape, but its serene beauty hides a darker reputation. Over the years, employees and hikers have shared eerie tales of unexplainable sounds echoing through the night. Today's story centers on a former park staff member whose horrifying experience still casts a shadow over her family, leaving her own daughter unable to speak about it to this day. It all began in the summer of 1987 when Cheryl, a 36-year-old single mother, relocated with her 14-year-old daughter to Dickson County, Tennessee. Cheryl had accepted a position at Ruskin Cave Recreational Park, a place perched atop a limestone ridge locals referred to as the Mountain. The park featured two prominent caves, Ruskin Cave and Jewel Cave, carved deep into the ancient rock. As part of her employment, Cheryl was provided living quarters on the park grounds, a perk she found ideal for starting this new chapter. The accommodations were modest but inviting. A small home equipped with a kitchen, bedrooms, and large windows overlooking the scenic wilderness. Cheryl felt optimistic, believing this move would offer both a fresh start for her family and an escape into nature. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the dense forest surrounding the caves fell into shadow, something sinister began to stir, turning their idyllic new home into the epicenter of an unrelenting nightmare. For the first few weeks, life at Ruskin Cave Recreational Park was peaceful. Cheryl worked her shifts at the park, her daughter attended school, and their evenings were spent together in their cozy little home nestled near the caves. The property was vast, surrounded by dense woods, a natural spring, and a picturesque creek that flowed through Ruskin Cave. The tranquil sounds of nature were a constant presence, especially the rushing creek that echoed off the limestone walls. One warm July night, Cheryl sat at the kitchen table, sifting through paperwork from the day's tours. It was around 10:30, and her daughter was being dropped off at the park's main gate after a local softball game. This routine didn't alarm Cheryl. Her daughter often walked the short path from the gate to their quarters. Through the window, Cheryl could see her daughter, still in her softball uniform, and clutching a large bag of candy she'd bought at the concession stand, making her way down the well-worn path beside the creek. The sound of the rushing water was particularly loud that evening, its echoes filling the night. Cheryl, accustomed to the background noise, returned her focus to her work. But moments later, the front door burst open. Her daughter stumbled in, trembling violently, her face as pale as a ghost. The candy bag was nowhere to be seen. Something about her daughter's wide, tear-filled eyes and the way her body shook told Cheryl that something terrible had happened. Her daughter tried to speak but couldn't form words. Tears streamed down her face as she stood frozen in shock. Cheryl rushed to her, wrapping her arms around her child, and noticed her daughter's back was scraped and her uniform smeared with dirt, as if she'd fallen or been pushed. Cheryl whispered reassurances, trying to calm her daughter enough to get an explanation, but then, as if drawn by an unseen force, her eyes darted to the window. Cheryl froze, her scream catching in her throat. Something enormous stood there, its massive form blocking most of the window frame. The figure lingered for only a moment before moving away, but the sound of heavy footsteps followed, circling the house and heading toward the front door. Without hesitation, Cheryl grabbed her daughter and fled to the back bedroom. She shoved the dresser against the door and frantically dialed the police. Her hands trembled so violently that she had to redial. The dispatcher immediately picked up on her terror as Cheryl choked out the words. Something had attacked her daughter, and now it was outside their home. 15 agonizing minutes later, the police arrived. By then, the thing, whatever it was, had disappeared. 2 officers scoured the property with flashlights while Cheryl's daughter, still visibly shaken, struggled to recount what had happened. She described walking along the creek when she heard heavy splashing nearby. Then something came for her. Her daughter shakily recounted the terrifying encounter. As she walked along the creek, something reached out from behind her. A massive hand, she described, that grabbed at her candy bag. When she resisted, she was knocked to the ground, leaving her back scraped and bruised. This explained the state she had stumbled in. The officers conducted a thorough search of the area, but what they found only deepened the mystery. Despite the ground being soft from recent rain, there were no clear footprints. Instead, they found strange depressions in the mud near the creek, too indistinct to identify. The candy bag was torn and scattered along the path, but, oddly, none of the candy had been taken. The mysterious figure and eerie screams. It all began on a chilling October night. Cheryl and her daughter were alone in their house when they first heard the eerie screams. They were unlike anything they had ever heard before, echoing through the stillness of the night. Cheryl, trying to calm her frightened daughter, assured her it was probably just the wind. But deep down, she knew it was something more sinister. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Cheryl saw a shadowy figure standing by the window, watching them. She froze, unable to move, as the figure seemed to disappear into the darkness. The screams continued, growing louder and more desperate, sending chills down their spines. The senior officer, a man with over 2 decades of experience in Dixon County, appeared unusually interested in Cheryl's description of the figure at the window. He pulled his partner aside, speaking in hushed tones as they glanced back at Cheryl and her daughter with concerned expressions. Based on Cheryl's account, whatever had been at the window stood at least 8 feet tall, far too tall for any person. Bears, common in the area, might have explained some parts of the encounter, but bears didn't grab candy bags or peer through windows like that. Before leaving, one officer advised Cheryl to keep her windows locked at night. Later, the senior officer confided to his wife that in all his years on the force, he'd never encountered a report like this. He didn't even know how to categorize it. A few nights later, Cheryl and her daughter were trying to regain some sense of normalcy. They resumed their nightly ritual of sitting on the front porch, sipping black tea from old ceramic mugs passed down by Cheryl's grandmother. The quiet evenings were usually a comfort, but this night would shatter their fragile peace. From somewhere near the far edge of the property, beyond the entrance to Ruskin Cave, came a sound that froze them both mid-sip. It wasn't like anything they'd heard before, a deep, guttural scream that echoed off the cave walls, reverberating across the property. It was so loud that even the crickets fell silent. Cheryl's daughter gripped her arm, spilling tea on the porch as the sound grew closer. The scream wasn't continuous but came in bursts, roars that started low and built to a horrifying pitch. Even their neighbor's dog, usually loud and reactive, whimpered and scratched at its door, desperate to be let inside. Cheryl and her daughter fled indoors, locking the door behind them. They spent the rest of the night huddled together, listening as the screams moved around the property, sometimes terrifyingly close, sometimes fading into the distance. The screaming finally stopped around 3 a.m., but by then, Cheryl was too exhausted and scared to think clearly. She fell into a restless sleep on the couch, leaving the lights on. Her dreams were plagued by haunting images. She saw the massive hands from the window again, this time reaching into her daughter's bedroom. In her dreams, she tried to run to her daughter, but her legs felt heavy, like she was moving through molasses. Then the scream returned, louder than ever, but this time it came from inside the house. Cheryl woke in a panic, drenched in sweat. Each time she bolted to check on her daughter, finding her safe but unable to shake the eerie feeling. This cycle repeated 3 times that night. The following morning, despite her exhaustion, Cheryl couldn't ignore the gnawing unease. After her daughter left for school, she ventured to the creek where her daughter had been attacked. In the daylight, she found something chilling. Large patches of vegetation near the creek had been completely flattened, as though something massive had been pacing back and forth. The paths were unnaturally perfect, parallel trails through the tall grass, marking the restless movements of whatever had been there that night. The discovery near the creek shook Cheryl to her core. Amid the flattened vegetation was a smell, pungent and nauseating, like a mix of wet dog and decay. But what truly unsettled her was finding one of her daughter's hair ties from the softball game lying in the middle of one of the paths. The elastic was stretched out unnaturally, as if something large and heavy had been toying with it. Cheryl called in sick that day, unable to bring herself to face work. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the eerily flattened trails. Every rustle of the wind in the trees made her jump. Exhaustion had taken its toll. Dark circles hung under her eyes. Her hands trembled at the slightest sound, and the coffee pot in the kitchen worked overtime as she downed her 6th cup by midday. Determined to protect her daughter, Cheryl decided to start asking around the neighborhood, no matter how absurd her story might sound. That afternoon, she drove down Yellow Creek Road to a small, white farmhouse she passed daily on her way to work. The house belonged to the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had lived in the area for over 40 years. If anyone knew the history of the caves and their strange happenings, it would be them. Mrs. Johnson was outside hanging laundry when Cheryl arrived. The moment Cheryl mentioned the screams, the older woman froze mid-motion, her hands gripping a damp sheet. Without a word, she called for her husband, and soon Cheryl was seated at their kitchen table, clutching yet another cup of coffee that Mrs. Johnson insisted she drink. Mrs. Johnson shared that they had been hearing those eerie screams for years. The first occurrence had been in 1952, shortly after they'd moved in. At the time, they'd assumed it was a mountain lion. But as Mr. Johnson explained, mountain lions don't walk on two legs. His wife nodded in agreement, adding small, unsettling details about odd occurrences they'd experienced over the decades. The Johnsons' farm dogs, known for their bravery against bears, would sometimes cower under the porch, trembling and whining on certain nights. These were the same nights when the distant screams would begin, growing louder as they seemed to circle the property. Mrs. Johnson grew quieter as she recounted a more recent incident. Her voice trembled as she mentioned Sarah, a tour guide at Jewel Cave. The previous summer in 1986, Sarah had led a group into the cave system when something began following them. It stayed just at the edge of their flashlight beams, splashing ominously through the water. The entire tour group fled in panic, and Sarah quit her job the very next day. The connection between Ruskin and Jewel Caves loomed large in Cheryl's mind. If the two were indeed linked by underground tunnels, as local lore suggested, it seemed possible that whatever had stalked her daughter and the tour group was using the caves to navigate the area unseen. As Cheryl prepared to leave, Mr. Johnson suddenly remembered something. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a worn, leather-bound journal. His father, a surveyor for the caves back in the 1920s, had kept meticulous notes about his experiences. Mr. Johnson's expression was grave as he handed the journal to Cheryl, explaining that his father had documented things in those caves, things that couldn't be explained by the natural world. Mr. Johnson's hands trembled as he flipped the pages of the old journal, stopping at a specific entry. He turned it toward Cheryl, and her coffee cup slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. There, drawn in faded ink, was a crude but unmistakable depiction of what Cheryl had seen at her window. A massive figure with a flat face, round eyes, and coarse, bushy hair, exactly as she'd described. The notes detailed the same hair length of 2 to 3 inches. Cheryl's breath caught as she read the date of the entry, July 1927, precisely 60 years before her daughter's horrifying encounter. The journal described how these creatures seemed to grow more active in the summer, frequently attempting to grab or lure children and teenagers, always under the cover of night and near water. Seeing the color drain from Cheryl's face, Mrs. Johnson reached across the table and gently grasped her hand. "Honey," she said softly, "maybe it's time you and your daughter found somewhere else to live." But Cheryl knew it wasn't that simple. She'd taken the job because they desperately needed the money. Relocating wasn't an option. Not in Dixon County, where opportunities were scarce. More than that, a gnawing instinct told her that leaving wouldn't solve the problem. Whatever this thing was, it had noticed them. Moving might not change that. As Cheryl drove home, her anxiety clawed at her. The sun dipped below the horizon, and she knew her daughter was inside finishing her homework. But as she pulled into the driveway, her breath hitched. Leading from the creek to her front door were massive, wet footprints. They were fresh, the water glistening in the fading light, and worse, they didn't walk away from the door. They stopped right at it, as if whatever had made them was still close by. Cheryl sat frozen in her car, the engine idling. Her heart pounded as she stared at the footprints, each one easily twice the size of a man's boot. Their shape was strange, not entirely human. Her maternal instincts screamed at her to get inside and protect her daughter, but another part of her brain fought to process what she was seeing. Was it still inside? Was her daughter okay? Suddenly, the worst scream she had ever heard shattered her thoughts. This wasn't the scream from the woods or the caves, it came from inside the house. Panic overtook her. Cheryl lunged for the tire iron in her trunk and bolted toward the front door. The screen door rattled in the evening breeze, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was her daughter and the source of that bone-chilling scream. The screen door hung off its hinges, and Cheryl froze as she heard movement inside, furniture being scraped and shifted. Then, amidst the noise, she caught her daughter's voice. She wasn't screaming, but talking softly to something. Cheryl burst through the doorway, tire iron in hand, only to stop dead in her tracks. The living room was a wreck. All the furniture had been pushed against the walls, leaving a clear, open space in the center of the room. The air was thick with the sickening stench of wet dog and decay. Her daughter stood in the middle of the room, staring upward, her face pale but unhurt. Without taking her eyes off the ceiling, she whispered, "It's been up there, watching me." Cheryl's heart pounded as she tilted her head to follow her daughter's gaze. Above them, in the crawl space opening, long, dark fingers curled around the edge. The ceiling creaked under the weight of something impossibly large shifting in the confined space. Dust and bits of drywall sprinkled down like a forewarning. "Mom, it's trying to take me," her daughter whispered, trembling. Cheryl's blood ran cold. Then came the noise, deep, guttural and distorted, like someone trying to speak underwater. It resonated through the room, vibrating in her chest. The tire iron in her hand felt useless against something so massive. Grabbing her daughter's arm, Cheryl slowly began backing toward the front door. But as they moved, the thing above them followed, its weight groaning against the ceiling beams. Then her daughter gasped and tugged at her. "Look at the window," her daughter said. Cheryl turned her head slightly, and her heart nearly stopped. Pressed against the glass was another face, smaller but with the same flat features and round, lifeless eyes. Behind it, shadows shifted in the darkness, more figures, watching, waiting. Cheryl realized with mounting horror that this wasn't just one creature, it was an entire group, a family perhaps, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, they had fixated on her daughter. Before she could process it, the ceiling access panel crashed down with a violent thud. Without thinking, Cheryl shoved her daughter through the front door and slammed it shut behind them. The sound of splintering wood erupted from inside as something huge dropped into the room. That was the last night Cheryl and her daughter ever spent at Ruskin Cave. They drove straight to a motel in Dixon County and never returned, not even to collect their belongings. Cheryl quit her job over the phone the next morning. When asked why, she simply refused to answer. A year later, in 1988, investigators followed up on their encounter. What they found only deepened the mystery of Ruskin Cave and the things that seemed to call it home. Dixon County, Tennessee, is no stranger to tales of the supernatural. For decades, reports of Bigfoot-like creatures towering 8 to 9 feet tall with flat faces, round eyes, and coarse, bushy hair have circulated through the region. Residents have described blood-curdling screams echoing through the woods and near the caves, particularly on humid summer nights when the creek swells. Even now, hikers and spelunkers in the area recount hearing eerie cries and spotting fleeting shadows in the darkness near Ruskin and Jewel Caves. As for Cheryl and her daughter, they never returned to the area. Her daughter still refuses to speak about that summer night, the memory buried deep but ever present. Cheryl, meanwhile, only tells her story to caution others. Stay away from the caves. And that brings us to the end of today's story. If you've stuck with me through the twists and turns of this eerie tale, comment "Tansei" below so I know you made it to the end. If you enjoyed delving into the strange and supernatural, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories just like this one. As always, keep an open mind, stay curious, and remember, I love you all. See you in the next episode.